past, we've done different things as a church for Memorial Day. We've shown videos in honor of those who have sacrificed their lives, and we've lit up the room in red, white, and blue and different things. Well, this year, I've decided to kind of incorporate and weave Memorial Day and what that stands for into the context of what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And so before we kind of get into all of that, I just want to remind you that we're in this book called 1 Corinthians, and it's this letter that's written to this church in Corinth that is got all kinds of problems, right? They've got all these issues, and they're going through all of these things, and Paul is responding to some of these questions that they have. And how many of you have ever watched the show Survivor, right? It's been on, I think, like forever. And I mean, it's just, I don't know how many seasons of it they have, but I think it's like 1,000 seasons. It's a lot. We used to watch it all the time as a family, and there was this, there's this game that they usually play, or at least some variation of this game, where they will have members of their team kind of on a platform that's over there, and then in front of them is like this huge maze of stuff, right? Things that can kill you probably. And they have this huge maze, and then they have these teammates that are supposed to go into the maze while the other teammate is screaming at them directions, which way to go and how to navigate the obstacles in this big maze. And so what happens is the person that's in the maze has to be in tune to or tuned in to the voice of their teammate. The problem is they're all screaming at the same time, and they're all yelling. You don't know, and they just met each other, so they don't know what their voice sounds like. And so they're kind of running into walls, or they're running over things and falling and breaking their legs and their arms and all the things, right? Maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration. Nevertheless, the only way they can really win is if they can tune their ears to the voice of the person that is screaming out to them, who can see clearly the direction that they need to go. And that's what Paul is doing in this letter to the Corinthians. He sets up the gospel as the voice that cuts through all of the other voices, all of the other noise that surrounds us, and it guides these people that are in the church of Corinth to safety, and I believe it guides us to safety as well. In the first 4 chapters, we saw how the gospel heals the divisions that are taking place in the church, right? It's such a diverse church, young, old, Jews, Gentiles, rich, poor. There's all these, they're all coming together, and there's just all this division that's going on. And Paul begins to address that in the first section. In the second section, in chapters 5 through 7, he shows them how the gospel gives clarity in the moral and sexual confusion of their society. And how many of us can just say, man, we're so glad that we're not in chapters 5 through 7 anymore. Last week, we crossed over into chapter 8 and into the third section of the letter, where Paul begins to explain how the gospel can begin to unite them even when they are culturally and politically divided. Now, one of the great moral gains of the second half of the 20th century is this belief that most people around the world, that most people, not all people, because there's still some areas of our planet that don't believe this, but most people believe that all people are to be respected and valued, right? All people, not just some. Weak people, poor people, hungry people, frightened people, people of different color, people of either sex, that there is this general belief that all people are to be valued, and that no one in the world has any right to try to mistreat them or to treat them in inequity, like without equal opportunity. That there's just this sense of rightness that we have as a country, And it's honestly, it's a value that our country has held, that we are all equal. And it's what people have gone and died for. They have fought for the fact that we could be a people free from tyranny, free from oppression. And this has often been expressed by talking about human rights. And that phrase, human rights, has become common in a way that wasn't even true even 100 years ago. It's become a way of saying that we, the worldwide community, we won't stand for tyranny. We won't stand for oppression. And so people like our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents went and fought against tyranny, against oppression. And we won't tolerate bullies that exploit people for their own ends. And we say that people have rights in order to say that other people don't have the right to abuse or exploit them. So here's the challenge, though. Whether the worldwide community yet knows how to move from talking about that, and certainly we've seen examples in our country and ways in which we've done something about that. But I think now we kind of live in this culture where we talk a lot about that equality. We talk about treating people with equity, and yet it doesn't really seem like we do anything about it. In any case, talking about rights as a way of making the point also has its own problems, right? When we start saying like we have the right to do this, or I have the right, or an entitlement, it can be a way of standing up for the weak, which is good, but can also be a way of asserting all kinds of other things, like, of our independent being, right? Like our independence of being able to do what we like to do, when we want to do them, and how we want to do them. It's this idea that I have the right to be arrogant. I have the right to be selfish. I have the right to be greedy or whatever. And although there is some truth, especially in our country, that you have the right to do those things, it doesn't necessarily mean that right is a good thing. Paul faces the problem of rights in dealing with the question of meat offered to idols, which he's been discussing in chapter 8, which is what we talked about last week, and by the way, we'll return to in chapter 10 next week. His whole point, though, is knowing your rights is only one side of the story. It's not enough to say that you have the right to do something, and so you're going to go ahead and do it. There may be occasions where the correct thing to do is to not act on your rights. So how is Paul going to make this point clear? He's going to describe at some length the rights that he has as an apostle, and he's going to show dramatically that he's deliberately not making use of these rights because he wants the Corinthian church, he wants the Corinthians to see that there can be something more than rights. That rights by themselves can lead, if we're not careful, to arrogance. The cure for which is obviously the demands of the gospel itself. So, this chapter has quite a bit of a different tone of voice. It's full of these rhetorical questions. Paul tends to take a little bit more of a teasing tone, a little bit of a snarky tone. It's why it's one of my favorite chapters in all of Scripture. And we're going to jump right in. Now, remember, he's setting them an example, right? And the example consists in the fact that though he has these rights, like he hasn't forgotten the rights that he has, he just has not made use of them. And Paul begins to explain why. And I've mentioned this before, but this church in Corinth is pretty diverse, right? It's made up of Jews, it's made up of Gentiles, young, old, rich, poor, people who had been religious for years, those who had no religious background at all. And again, that brought conflict into the church. And friends, it just always does. When you have that many different backgrounds and that much diversity in one place, it creates conflict. A lot of people have this rosy picture of multi-ethnic unity, but bringing people together, people of diverse backgrounds, it always creates conflict and tension. And what that does is create an opportunity. This is what I believe. It creates an opportunity for the unique beauty and power of the gospel to shine. The world longs to see this kind of unity. It does. It almost idealizes it, or we see it in movies, we see it in classrooms, we hear about this whole thing going on where it's this, let's be diverse and let's be in unity, and there's this kind of this rosy picture that's been painted for us, and here's the reality is very few people are able to accomplish this. I'm going to say something that might feel a little bit like some of you, it's just going to be a trigger word for some of you, and some of you are going to agree with me, and some of you might disagree with me. Well, I'm just going to tell you the truth because I always do. Critical race theory can't accomplish unity. What the world tries to accomplish through things like CRT, the gospel has already accomplished through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So with that in mind, let's jump into Paul's conclusion on this. And if you just turned me off because I said that, turn me back on and let me explain. Verse 19, we're going to start there. For though I am free from all, for the sake of the gospel, I have made myself a servant to all. Now, the word for servant there is actually slave, by the way. A slave is totally owned by someone else, and while a terrible, terrible institution, it's an analogy that the people that Paul is addressing and talking to in the church would have been familiar with. Paul says, I've given up control of every preference, every perspective to the gospel. He says, I claim no rights to any of them, and I think that all I think about now is how, and he goes on in verse 20, he says, to the Jews I became like a Jew to win Jews, which is a really odd statement. If you understand Scripture, if you understand who Paul is, that statement, to the Jews I became like a Jew to win Jews, is really interesting. Because how could Paul become as a Jew to the Jews? I mean, ethnically, Paul is a Jew, right? So how could he become a Jew if ethnically he already is a Jew? How could someone who is ethnically a Jew become a Jew? What that meant was that for Paul, even his Jewishness, his ethnicity, his culture, he could play it up or he could play it down depending on what the needs of the gospel were at that moment. To those under the law, I become as one under the law, though not being myself under the law. What he means is, I was willing to live culturally like those who keep the law. What I don't mean is that I put myself back under the law as a means of earning salvation, which is how he lived his life as a Pharisee, right? He used to be under the law as a point of salvation, but now he can be under the law for the sake of reaching those who are under the law. Verse 21 says, to those outside the law, I become as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, meaning I was willing to live culturally like those who weren't under Jewish law, but I don't mean that I cast off all morality and start living like a crazy sinner. I'm still bound by the moral law of Christ. And he says, and I did that, guess what? So that those outside the law might be won. Verse 22, to the weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. or better have the chance to point them to salvation. And here's the key phrase. He says in verse 23, I do it all. Everything I do now, I do for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. And then verse 24, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize, so that you may obtain it? So here's Paul's second analogy, right, for how he thinks about his life. The first is I think of myself as a slave to the gospel, and then the second is a professional athlete. A professional athlete gets rid of everything that keeps them from winning, right? They do whatever necessary to win. A professional swimmer, this is the best example that I could come up with like getting rid of everything. A professional swimmer does what, right? They shave their legs, right, and their chest, and if they're a guy, and they wear a Speedo, and they put a little rubber cap on their head, and they do everything possible in order to win their race. They use every means necessary in order to win the race. Not just run the race, but to win, or swim the race, but to win the race. And I was thinking, this may come as a shock to some of you, but I don't wear Speedos on a regular basis, and I'm not really into like the shower cap thing, and I'm sorry for the visual that I just gave you, but I was thinking if I was going to be a competitive swimmer, that's what I would probably choose to wear, right? I would go to the meet wearing those things, and I might have the right to show up to the meet wearing my longer swim shorts and a tank top and be like, hey, it's my right. I can do whatever I want. And I can say, I'm gonna do the race this way. That's my right to do that. But it's not a wise way in which to win the race. It's not a right that I should exercise if I want to win. So Paul says, I have the right to a lot of things in the Christian life that I lay aside. I set those aside to help me win people to Jesus. Specifically, in chapter 9, Paul mentions three things that he's given up to help him win people to Jesus. In verse 4, he says, don't we have the right to eat and drink? Again, remember, he's responding to questions that are coming from the church, and he's just reiterating their question. And this is a reference, again, to the controversy over whether one could eat meat that had been offered to idols, because basically all of the meat that was purchased had been presented to an idol at some point, right, for a blessing. And many of the new Christians, particularly the Jewish ones, they thought this meat was completely tainted. In verse 5, he says, don't we have the right to be accompanied by a believing wife? If you remember back to chapter 7, Paul explained that he remained single because it was more helpful to the mission, right? He's like, listen, I have the right to be married. I'd like to be married, but at this time, what's really helpful to the mission is that I remain single. Verse 12, if others have a right to receive financial benefits from you, don't we even more? Or do only Barnabas and I have no right to refrain from working? So Paul and Barnabas here had chosen not to take a salary for their ministry. Even though many of the other apostles and Christian leaders had taken a salary, they had been provided for by their churches, by their faith communities, Paul and Barnabas chose not to. He's not saying that it's wrong for that to take place. He's just saying, listen, it's within my rights to do that. I'm just choosing not to. And the reason why is because at that time there were many people who were accusing the apostles of making up the resurrection. They were being accused of lying about the resurrection in order to get rich. And so Paul says, the Holy Spirit has shown me that my testimony will be even more compelling if I don't take any money for it. Like to show you that I'm not just telling you stories to get rich and powerful. also just having this beautiful, foresight of knowing that, 1,000 years later, many people will come along and say, yeah, the only reason people go into Christianity is because it's a business. They do it to get rich. And I'm not saying that there aren't people who take advantage of that. Certainly there are. And you should avoid them at all costs. But Paul's response is like, listen, I have a right to be financially supported in my work like anybody else, but I've given up that right for the sake of the gospel. No, just full disclosure, I'm not giving up that right. Right? You guys, the church provides for my family, and I'm paid by the church. I'm paid a reasonable wage for where our church is located in the city of San Antonio. Am I getting rich off of this? No, I'm not getting rich, but I am taken care of and well compensated, and I appreciate that. So I just want to acknowledge that. Verse 15, for my part, I have used none of these rights. This is Paul speaking. Verse 18, what then is my reward? To preach the gospel and offer it for free of charge, and he says, and not make full use of any of my rights in the gospel. Again, verse 25 says, athletes who compete exercise extreme self-control. Self-control in everything. He says, I do it all for the sake of the gospel. They do it to receive a perishable crown, but we an imperishable crown. It's like I'm running a race for souls. I'm running a race for the souls of those who are lost, and I'm willing to strip away anything and everything that doesn't move me closer to that goal. Michael Phelps, of course, most of you will know that name. Some of you might not now. It's been quite a few years since he's raced as a swimmer, but he's the most decorated Olympic athlete of all time. He has won a total of 28 medals, which means by himself he has won more medals than 70% of the countries that compete in the Olympics have won in their histories. Think about that. That's crazy. But to win those medals came at a great cost. During his peak training seasons, he would swim about 12 miles a day every single day. He did this for 1,800 consecutive days without missing a single day. Listen to this. He ate 12,000 calories a day. Now, I'm working on some things in my life. Let's just say that. My fitness pal is like annoying me right now. And in it, I've created a calorie deficit. And I think right now, the calories I'm allowed are like 2,100 calories per day. And I read something like this, and I'm like, he's eating 12,000 calories. Listen to what he would eat. He would literally eat a pound of pasta every day for lunch, and then another pound of pasta for dinner. And there's this kind of phrase that goes around in nutrition as you're trying to lose weight and you're trying to get healthy and stuff. And these guys who are really mean people, they say, apparently, you cannot out-exercise a bad diet. And I would say, Michael Phelps would say differently to that. I mean, apparently you can out-exercise a bad diet. Of course, if you're swimming 12 miles a day, you can probably eat whatever you want, right? And he did all of this for a bunch of records and a bunch of medals that when he dies are just going to end up in a museum somewhere. That his records are just going to, and listen, it's possible that someone will come along and they're going to break those records. So he did all of this just for that someday our grandkids, maybe our kids now, will hear the name Michael Phelps and ask us, who is that? Right? They have absolutely no knowledge of him. If you've ever been into the AT&T Center, and is that what they're calling it? Is it still the AT&T Center where the Spurs play? Frost, yeah, that's right. AT&T's terrible. So, yeah, the Frost Bank Center, you go in there, and up in the rafters, there's like all these banners, right? And a lot of those people, like, unless you've been around for a long time, you're like, I don't even know who those people are, right? So Paul says, if athletes train like they do for crowns that perish and names in rafters that fade into oblivion, how much more should we be willing to discipline our lives for the souls of people that last forever? The crown we are striving for is not having our name in the rafters or in the record books or for some sort of medal. It's the soul of your neighbor. It's the soul of your coworker or your family member or your grandkids. Like, it's for their sake. And so I want to apply this to us in two ways. First is the church. I want to explain how this impacts us as a church and how we organize ourselves. And then second, I want to challenge us personally to think about how we're ordering our personal lives. First, three things about the church. Number one, we must sacrifice preference to reach the lost. We must sacrifice preference to reach the lost. Many of you will not know this, but this church is about 30 years old. Lifehouse Church used to be called the Church at Stone Oak, and prior to that, it was the Church on the Way, San Antonio. And the reason we are here almost 30 years, it's 28 years, so we're a couple years off, but 30 years later, we are here, Lifehouse, because the Hicks family were willing to make themselves uncomfortable for the sake of reaching others. They did it along with a group of people. They moved their family from Los Angeles, California, out to San Antonio, Texas. They planted this church, and they were uncomfortable, and they sacrificed an enormous amount to get this church up and going. And people came around them, people who they led to Christ. They came around them, and those people also sacrificed and gave a lot, not just of their time in serving, but in their resources. This building was built by people who came before most of us that are in this room, and through the sacrifice of the finances that people gave. And they did it with a bunch of people who were willing to do it for the sake of the gospel, that they might see some saved. And sadly, across our country right now, we see churches who won't do that. I heard one guy say that if the 1950s ever come back, a lot of our churches are going to be ready. Think about that for a second. And it's true. And I don't mean to degrade churches. I would never want to belittle the bride of Christ, ever. But I can tell you firsthand, as someone who's traveled all over West Texas into towns where churches have just never adapted and never responded. They held on to their culture and their traditions so much so that they lost the next generation. And the churches are literally dying. They don't want to change because change is uncomfortable. The sad truth is that many of those churches prioritized maintaining their traditions over reaching their grandchildren. And I don't share that so that we look down on them or think to ourselves, well, thank God we're not that way, or something along those lines. Because I think you need to realize how easy it is for that spirit to creep into any church. Nobody set out to say, you know what? Forget the grandchildren, we're holding on to our traditions. But there was something that kept them from adapting and saying, no, we need to be a little more uncomfortable. We need to set aside our comforts and our traditions for the sake of those who are coming up behind us. How willing are we to put up with things that we don't like in church for the sake of reaching others? Right? To put up with music styles or topics that may not be your favorite. How willing are we to put up with chapters 5 through 7 because it's uncomfortable, or not because, but it is uncomfortable, but we're willing to put up with that uncomfortableness because we live in a culture that is over-sexualized, where we have our children and our grandchildren who are asking questions about their sexuality, and they're asking questions about the truth of what they need to know on these topics. We're willing to talk about those. We're willing to be uncomfortable, not for our sake, but for the sake of those who are lost. How committed are we to this church reaching our community? Make this really real for you for a minute. Paul's illustration for how he applied 1 Corinthians 9 was having Timothy, his travel companion and disciple, who was an adult, get circumcised. For Jews, being circumcised was a thing that you did not only to obey the law, but actually to show that you respected your heritage. And Timothy had a Jewish mom, but he had a Gentile dad, and so he was never circumcised. And that became a huge problem as he was trying to minister to those Jews who needed Jesus. They saw it as a rejection of their culture and a rejection of his heritage, and they thought Timothy was disrespecting them. And so Paul argued with them and said, listen, according to the gospel, Timothy doesn't need to be circumcised, right? And you demanding that he be circumcised is pretty unreasonable. But in Acts chapter 16, verse 3, in order to remove any obstacle to the gospel, Paul had Timothy, a grown man, circumcised. Now that gives a whole new meaning to getting some skin in the game. Am I right? Keeping that in the back of your mind, actually don't keep that in the back of your mind. That should be the standard of being uncomfortable, right? It's a cheesy joke, I know, but I feel like Timothy, if he were alive today, would say to some of us who really get frustrated and upset when there's change, like when we change the seating arrangement, right, for 10 at 10, right? And you come in and you're like, I don't know where to sit. I got to go find another church. This place is terrible, right? They changed the stage up again. What's wrong? Timothy would say, oh, really? That's your problem? That you can't find your seat? Guess what? I can't sit down for a little while. Paul's like, stop worrying about you not liking the kind of music. He's like, my becoming all things to all people cost me a lot more than you putting up with a change of scenery, a change of seats, a change of music. We're always asking, how can we best set up Lifehouse to reach more people? And I tell you that not as any sort of, here's the problem. Here's the problem in American church is every pastor says, oh, I don't care about growth. I don't care about having more people. And it's usually because they don't have them, right? Or they'll say, no, it's not about the numbers in the seats. It's not about this, and that's not what's important, and or any of those things. But here's the problem: is actually it really isn't my identity isn't about in how many people attend Lifehouse or watch online or any of those things. To me, those are false numbers. Healthy numbers are how many people are getting baptized and how many people are being discipled and growing in their relationship with the Lord. But one of the things that we have discovered is last year at 10 at 10, we came together, all one church under one roof, and we could do that, right? We could do it because it's summertime, people are on vacation and stuff, and we could pack out this space. And we got to the end of 10 at 10, and we were like, there's a lot of people that are like, we didn't think it was going to work, but we really like it, and we don't want to go back to 2 services. Mainly the worship team that has to be here at 7:30. But But there were people who were like, we really loved, there were people that I met that I didn't even know go to our church. And that's what's going to happen is first service left, and you might not even know who comes to first service. And so what we discovered kind of coming out of that season was that we really feel like God wants us as a church to be one faith community. Now, obviously, we can do that for 10 Sundays in the summer, but we can't do that in growing periods and throughout the rest of the year. It's just too difficult. There's not enough space in here. And so we're starting to make some decisions and to make some plans and get some drawings of what it would look like for us to expand our sanctuary, because we want to grow as a church, and we do want to be in one service. But here's the thing, before everybody starts freaking out about this, is we're just in the preliminary stages, but we want to expand the sanctuary to where our church can grow to about 600 to 700. Right now, we're at, last Sunday was 400, this Sunday will be 100, and so we're right around the 350, 400 mark, and we want to grow to that size because we believe that size is a sustainable size to be able to plant churches. Here's the thing, if we expand the sanctuary and we grow to 600 people, and then we're like, oh man, we're capped out, we got to have another service. As long as I'm the pastor of the church, it's not going to happen. We're not going back to multiple services. One faith community, we're going to start sending people out, start planting churches. And part of the expansion will include, on the first floor, it'll include apartments for ministry housing so that people can come in who are called into the ministry, get trained and equipped for a year or two, and then be sent out, preferably into West Texas where churches are dying and they need people out there, and they don't know that they're going to West Texas, but they're called into the ministry. They don't care. They want to just lead people to Jesus. I tell you that, and this will be the last thing I say about that, because there's lots more to come on that, but this is my promise to you. We're not going to go into debt to do that, right? We're not going to go. God said, one of the two things he said to me is, get the church out of debt and plant churches. We've gotten the church out of debt not to put the church back into debt. So we're not going to go back into debt, but we haven't planted churches. And I believe we need to grow some in order to sustain that. And then the other thing is, I'm not going to do a building campaign. I just won't. There's not going to be a thermometer out in the Welcome Center telling you how far we got to go and make you do pledges and all this. In fact, I'm not even going to ask those of you who give regularly and tithe to Lifehouse as your faith community. I won't even ask you to give above and beyond that. What I will do is ask those who say, Lifehouse is my faith community, but they don't give. I'm going to challenge that and say, if you call this your home, I'm going to ask that you give. And I've done the numbers. If we do that, there'll be plenty to build the addition. We could double our budget. We won't double the budget, but we could. That's how much is there. And I say all that to say is I just trust God in it. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen because he provides the resources to make it happen, just like he did the hospital boat. All right. I hope all of us will feel a little uncomfortable all the time here. The moment we stop feeling uncomfortable and think, oh, this is so perfect, this is our dream church, I'm so comfortable here, we can be assured that we are no longer focused on the lost, but just meeting our needs. Number 2, we must care not only about depth, but width also. A lot of Christians, when they talk about their church, they seem to think that the only measure God cares about is whether they are a deep church or a doctrinally faithful church. And they'll say things like, we don't worry about the width of our ministry, we just worry about the depth. And I get that, I understand that. We can't control how many people will receive Christ and believe the gospel. We have to preach the truth unapologetically. We will preach the gospel, we will preach the truth. But we leave the results of that to him. But I at least want you to see that Paul was not satisfied with merely being in the right. He was like, I'll do whatever it takes to become whatever I need to become, that I might be all in order to save some. Charles Spurgeon, a guy I don't agree with all the time, but appreciate and respect him a lot. He's one of the church's most important theologians in its history. He says it this way. And think about Charles Spurgeon. He never shied away from the gospel or the truth, but this is what he says. If my hearers are not converted, I feel like I've just wasted my time. I've lost the exercise of brain and heart. I feel as if I lost my hope and lost my life unless I find for my Lord some of his blood-bought ones. I would sooner bring one sinner to Jesus Christ than unpack all the mysteries of the divine word. For conversion is the thing we are to live for. Man, I want that to be my focus every time I step on stage to teach. Right? We want to get our doctrine right, of course. We don't want to shy away from the difficult topics that we find in Scripture. But we are not content to just simply preach the truth accurately. We want, by all means, to save some. We want to see people come to Jesus. When I was a senior in high school and I graduated from high school, my high school pastor gave me a Bible. And I should have brought it up here and showed it to you. I still have it to this day. And it's the most worn Bible that I have. And on the front of it, where you would normally put your name, he put the words, whatever it takes. Whatever it takes to take the gospel so that some might be saved. Now pause for a second, because some of us are probably thinking, I'm just not comfortable with this talk of saving somebody, right? It feels a little bit smug or imperialistic, right? Like we're better than everybody and we've got to run out with some Messiah complex to save everyone. I just want to be clear, we're not capable of saving anyone. And we're not out there preaching ourselves or preaching Lifehouse or any of those things. You're not going to find hope in any of us. But the gospel message is that God sent a Savior and all people are lost without him. But he offers forgiveness. He offers healing. He offers restoration. He offers new life for all who will come to him. We can no more deny that than I think I could deny Jesus himself. And if in your heart you don't long to see other people come to Jesus, or if you feel like it's wrong to try and persuade someone else to come to Jesus, and of course I mean doing it respectfully, I'm going to say something that you might not like, but I would question whether or not you actually believe the gospel. How could you? If you believe it for yourself, if you believe the forgiveness and the truth and the grace of what the gospel of Jesus Christ has provided for you, how could you not long for that for someone in your life? The gospel is that there's only one hope for all people everywhere. How could we believe that and not be doing everything, whatever it takes, to get that to someone else? The third thing for our church is this. We must seek to reach all people in the community, not just one kind. It's clear from what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9 that he was focused on reaching different kinds of people in Corinth, not just one kind. You had Jews, you had people under the law, you had Gentiles, those outside the law. He was trying to reach them all, and it was hard. It was really, really difficult. You know how much easier it would have been for Paul to plant, the first Jewish church of Corinth, and then of the Jews of Corinth, and the first Gentile church of Corinth over here. It would have saved him a lot of headache and a lot of writing. Because these people would have all kind of been like-minded and believed in the same thing, and these people would have been all like-minded and believed in the same thing. And, he could have just gone to one side of the city and planted a church focused on a specific ethnicity or a specific bent religiously, and yet he didn't. It would have been way easier. They all would have already thought the same about meat questions and political questions, but Paul didn't do it. Instead, he challenged the church to put some of their cultural preferences aside to reach someone else, because he knew that what Jesus wanted, that what would glorify him, is a united community, not a segregated one. I'll just tell you, one of the reasons we offer Spanish translation at Lifehouse is because I don't believe in a segregated Hispanic church or ministry. I just don't. It's contrary to what our denomination does. We have a national Hispanic district, and I don't necessarily agree with that. It doesn't mean that I can't be respectful of the decision, but as a church, it's something that I can oversee. To me, we need our Hispanic brothers and sisters, a part of our community. And so we offer Spanish translation and not a Spanish service because we want to integrate them into the life of our church. And have we done the best job at it? No, we haven't. Is there things and steps that we can take to be better at that? Absolutely we can. But our church should be a place where all ethnicities, all ages, we should see people on our worship team, and we do, of all ages, right? Where young and old worship together. This is what is the heart of Christ. Unity, not segregation. To the Jews, he said, I become like a Jew, which means I did Jewish things. I ate Jewish food. I listened to Jewish music. I entered the Jewish struggles. I wore Jewish clothes. I made Timothy get circumcised. To the weak, I became weak, Paul says. Even though I knew theologically I was free to eat the bacon, I refused to do anything that put a stumbling block between me and someone else. He made all of these cultural adaptations to reach people. And that was hard, and it was uncomfortable. Lighthouse, the gap between us and many of our neighbors is often a cultural one. We know that Jesus, just hear me out, we know that Jesus didn't just die for Republicans. Right? Jesus didn't just die for political conservatives or Democrats or liberals or white people or middle-class family or African Americans. He didn't just die for a certain group of people, not just Jews, but Gentiles. It's so easy for us to nod our heads at that in affirmation, but it's so hard when the rubber meets the road. Let me show you what I mean, and fair warning, this story is going to be hard for some of you, but when Paul is talking to the church in Corinth, he's addressing things that were culturally rights that they had, right? It's not that these things weren't important to some people. They were important. And I'm not saying that all perspectives are equally valid, and I'm certainly not saying that we ever are muted or unclear about injustice or anything wrong about the sanctity of life, about the evils of racism, about equality under the law. I'm saying that there are times that my particular perspective on the best way to set up society, or my opinion about the best people to lead us there, or my interpretations of some event, there are times where I will dial that back because it's more important that people hear and experience the gospel than to hear my opinion. It's not that these things aren't important. Of course they're important. It's the gospel of Jesus Christ that is much more important. And I don't want people to get confused into associating a particular culture or a particular slant on secondary matters with the gospel of Jesus. I have a right to say whatever I want up here. But sometimes I turn down that right a little bit so that I may, by all means, save some. We see a great example of this philosophy at work in the early church. It's such an important example, but it's overlooked. If you remember, if you went with us through the book of Acts, you'll see this, and I'm going to close this out here soon, but churches were led by Gentiles were experiencing Jewish flight. The Jewish people were leaving, and vice versa. And so the church leaders came together and they tried to work something out. Their solution, however, at first seemed rather confusing. They basically said, listen, stop being sexually immoral, stop sleeping with prostitutes, and oh, by the way, we're also going to say, stop eating something that's been strangled. And it's like, okay, we understand like the decision, like, okay, yes, stop sleeping with prostitutes. That makes a lot of sense. But of all of the Hebrew laws, you're going to say stop eating the food that has been strangled, the meat that's been strangled. Like, that's not why they include it. James explains the reason. He said for these two regulations, he says, from the ancient generations, Moses had in every city those who proclaim him. In other words, in every city, there were a lot of Jews, lost Jews, who needed to be reached for Jesus. And when the Gentiles are out in the parking lot barbecuing things that had been strangled, it would produce this major stumbling block for the Jews. The apostles knew that if these unsaved Jews came into the church and the Gentiles were in the back barbecuing choked gophers, that was going to be a problem, right? That the Jews would be offended by this. And so they're like, hey, let's not do that, right? The Jews aren't able to stomach that. No pun intended. But the Gentiles have, you could say the Gentiles have the right to eat choked squirrels or whatever they were eating. But we are asking you to forgo that right so that more unsaved Jews in your community can hear the gospel. There will be times where God asks you to forego things that are your right as Christ followers in order to save those who are lost. For us personally, and I'll just give you these real quick. If you think reaching people is like a race that you're trying to win, that will impact your life drastically. Stop thinking of evangelism as a duty you perform and think of it as a race that you're trying to win. Have you ever thought about how your career can contribute to the mission in the kingdom of God? Some of us have been given jobs that have given us opportunities to go to places and be the gospel in those places, to be a representation of the gospel to those places. What lifestyle changes could we make to free up some bandwidth in our life for the sake of the advancement of the gospel? Here's a big one. Can we critique our own culture? Like Paul was doing, when Paul says, I become a Jew to the Jews, he's really showing us that he was removed enough from his culture that he could critique it when necessary. His commitment to Christ outweighed his commitment to Judaism. Leslie Newbegin says that the true test of Christian maturity is the ability to allow the gospel to challenge my culture. Yes, I love America. And yes, I love my culture, and I am so grateful for those who gave their lives for this country and for us to have the freedom to gather here today. I love our country, but I love the gospel more. And where my culture falls short of the gospel, I want to be the first to point that out. Is there an opinion that you need to dial back so as to not be a distraction to the gospel? What preferences do we need to forego to create environments better able to reach others? How can you begin to include someone not like you in your social rhythms? Reaching out to and including people in your social circles that are not from your cultural background. Whom could you invite to start reading the Word with you? Lifehouse, verse 24, do you not know that in a race all the runners run? Like they all fulfill their duty, but only one receives the prize. They all run. They all might even finish the race, but there is only one winner. And so my challenge to all of us is to be that winner. Athletes who compete exercise extreme self-control in everything. They do it to receive a perishable crown, but we an imperishable crown. Think with me for a moment as you hear this story of someone you've probably never heard of. Her name is Mary Clark. Mary Clark grew up in one of the most privileged, desirable neighborhoods in the world, at least it used to be, called Beverly Hills, California. She grew up burdened over the brokenness and hopelessness that was felt by many in prisons there. As she began to get involved in ministering to them, she found that a huge obstacle was that every time she left, she would drive back to the comfort of her home in Beverly Hills. And so she decided to do something totally unorthodox. She asked for a cell, and they gave her one. And that's where she chose to spend decades of her life in a little 10 by 10 cell. The inmates were so baffled by and drawn to her, they called her the prison angel. She was so revered, she once walked into a prison riot where bullets and tear gas were in the air. But when they saw Mary, the riot stopped. Because she had become one of them, she could reach them. I'm not saying that that is our new evangelistic strategy. Me in a 10 by 10, probably not going to happen. I don't even think the prison system would probably allow it today. I'm not sure. But I am saying that history has been changed by people willing to do whatever it takes for the sake of the gospel, so that they, by all means, might save some. Are we willing to do that as a church, as an individual? Are we willing to do whatever it takes for the sake of the lost in your life? What will Lifehouse be known for 30 years from now? I hope it's about seeking and saving the lost. Let's pray.